All right. Greetings, everyone. All the participants who are joining us. My name is Iman Karrar, and I am advisor to the Minister of Irrigation and Water Resources of Sudan, and will be the facilitator for today's seminar. So to all, welcome to the World Water Week New Look at Home webinar. A few logistical statements that I'd like to make. First, that all lines for participants are muted. Also, please submit any question that you have to the Q&A function, and you can do it anytime throughout the seminar. Please do not place it in the chat box because we won't be able to see that. We will be taking questions after the presentations are made. So this seminar is really about, is titled Linking Climate Information, Water Governance and Justice. And as we speak now, when we're speaking about climate change, there are bad floods in China, Pakistan, Afghanistan. You might have been following the news, the wildfires in California. And also we remember the latest drought that hit Victoria Falls in late last year. These are all water-related climate effects that are of relevance to our discussion today. So for our seminar, we use the metaphor, it takes three to tango. And we thought that it's very appropriate because of the interdependencies and intricacies that connect climate information, water governance, and justice. And it's of very much, we'll be handling these three aspects. We will be looking at good water governance, which is about participation, transparency, empowerment, leveling the playing fields to participate. And on the other hand, we have justice, which is about equity, and equity not only in access to water, to decision-making platforms, platforms to also for recourse, and this with a climate information, which is really about what kind of information we're talking about, the source of information, the equity in access to this information. And in a digital economy like we have now, for example, we are connected to the internet, but there are those probably who would have wanted to join the webinar, but do not have that access, and mainly, I mean, in developing countries. So the equity goes right across, and if you look at these three aspects and put them in a matrix in both axes, there will be a lot that we could be talking about. And this also is not just how climate change triggers action, but how people respond to build resilience to climate change. So we look at it from both angles. And in this exciting seminar, we've got three esteemed speakers lined up. We have with us Professor Erik Kihlström from the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute. Also, we have Dr. Marianne Kielen from the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, Siwi Water Governance Facility, who unfortunately in the last minute had compelling reason for not joining us. And we have with us our dear Dr. Jenny Gronwall, who's a member of the World Water Week Scientific Program Committee, who will be talking on her behalf. And Jenny is the advisor to Siwi on water policy and rights. Also, our third speaker is Professor Jonas Ebbesson from the Stockholm Environmental Law and Policy Center at the Stockholm University, and the chair of the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee. So our speakers, I will give the floor to them right now, and each one will take us through the respective parts, and they have 5 minutes each. So Professor Erik, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Iman, and good evening from Sweden. I will talk about building and sharing climate information and services. I'm working at the National Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute, and we are very much dealing with this. So I will tell you about some of our experiences with this. Please, next slide. Thanks. So it's much about climate information, and we are talking also about sustainable water management, and the problem is similar in different fields, of course. But for the hydrological cycle, we know it's highly sensitivity to climate change. A warmer climate leads to more evaporation and more water in the air, and therefore it tends to become even wetter where it's wet today and drier where it's dry. And that also leads to more extreme events. And we have both stronger flooding and stronger drought events as a result of climate change. And Ayman was mentioning some of the current episodes now in the monsoon flooding, etc. And there are numerous other examples. Also flooding associated with tropical cyclones, which is highly devastating, of course. And there are also other areas with drought conditions. We also had strong forest fires in Australia earlier on this year. Now, climate information. This is very much about the little guy in the middle here. This is the decision maker, and he or she has a lot of questions and thoughts about future climate and what is happening. So how can we help this guy? So please take the next slide. This is about climate services, and exactly this is what it's all about. So climate service is some provision of climate information to assist in this decision-making process. And there are several definitions of this, and this is one of them from a European climate project called Climate Europe. And here we state that this service must respond to the user needs. So it's not just the information, but it's information needed by this user. We also say that this information must be based on scientifically credible information and use scientific expertise as well. And finally, it requires a strong degree of engagement between users and providers when this information is being produced. So can we go to next slide, please? So these are the kind of building blocks for setting up climate services. First, of course, we need a general knowledge about the climate system and how it works and what kind of climate, the variation and the change that we see in this climate. And to get to that, we can use observations. So we need records of long-term observations. This can be in situ data, it can be remote sensing data from satellites, etc. But there are also several other sources of information, and climate models not least here. If we want to look also into future climate and climate change, we need climate change scenarios and projections of future climate. But also other types of data can be needed if we want to look into impacts of climate change, and that can relate, for instance, to land use or population growth or other kind of scenarios. I also stressed before the scientific documentation, and we also need synthesis, of course, since there is a wealth of information of very different sources, and to get the synthesis of this and get a perspective and guidance for people with this, the decision maker at the end is very important as well. So I will get to my final slide and try to stress then that, I mean, we all know that as the climate system is truly global, it really calls for also an international collaboration to build these climate services. We need to have good standards for observations and monitoring. We also need joint protocols for climate modeling to provide scenarios that are useful for all of the globe. And also this information is produced in some places, but not in all countries, for instance. So it's also needed that we have a good openness, and we strive for openness and accessibility of these data all around the world. We also have to think when we set up climate services that it's a long-term perspective. Climate is changing over long-term time periods, and we need to look into this into decades to come. So it's a long-term commitment, both on observations, but also for building and improving climate models, for instance. Finally, I want to stress again that there is a very strong local need here for the decision maker. Often the decisions are at a local scale or a regional scale. So we need to be able to provide information in a local and regional context at high resolution often. We need to interpret the global and large scale picture, for instance, from the IPCC report to the place where you live and where you have your potential problem. And that really calls for a strong interaction between providers and users of this information, so that we can understand and incorporate the user needs when we are building these climate services. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Erik. And we move straight into Dr. Jenny Gronwall. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eamon. First slide, please. Next slide. Yes, there we go. Thank you. So we're now talking governance. So let's say that that is the second leg in the tango dance. And governance, in whatever form we think of it, takes place and occurs at many levels. We talk about this as multi-layered or multi-level governance. And it can be seen in how most countries have multiple levels of government, including local, regional, state, national, and federal level. The constituting, sorry, I'm not gonna, right, okay, I'm showing my video now. The constituting elements of governance at different levels span from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development, which was set up as part of the 2030 Agenda under SDG 17, to very informal networks, to village or community assemblies on the ground. And in this mix, many organizations which are found more or less outside of the official administration have interests in policy decisions and outcomes, and are consulted and or attempt at influencing governance. Public participation is called for in the UN Climate Convention, the Rio Declaration, the Aarhus Convention, and in many other pieces of international law. And participation is paramount. But it has also been called wicked and a paradox, not least because coming generations cannot have a say in decisions and planning made today. Next slide, please. To overcome parts of this wickedness with participatory climate governance, a range of sectors are responsible for adaptive policies and measures to address the health risks of climate change, including water and sanitation, trade, agriculture, disaster management, and development. Water and climate can both be seen as cross-cutting concerns that interact. Although in this graph here at the right, we actually see water in the middle of it all. Either way, institutions and organizations need to think and act beyond the mandates they have and outside the box. And they must reach out and work together, even if they don't have an explicit mandate in a certain sphere. They need to think across borders and identify and manage conflicts on how to use water for what, who to prioritize in water allocations, etc., to address climate issues. And they need to create synergies and joint benefits in climate planning. This also means that policy processes need to take a whole of society approach, a holistic approach, by ensuring consultation with and participation of the concerned and representatives of those who cannot otherwise be heard. Next slide, please. A discernible and promising trend today is that focus is shifting. Climate policies have traditionally been overseen by environment ministries, which have often had limited power in the government. But now the climate agenda is increasingly moving towards more central and influential locations. This means that there is an opportunity to empowering climate policy at multiple levels. However, if we agree that governance takes place at multiple levels, we need to take into account how individuals and communities consider water-related climate risks and effects, and how water and other climate shocks are responded to by them. In other words, their management of everyday risks matters, and the everyday decision making at the household level and upwards should be supported in order to build resilience across society. But we need to be aware that a household or a community's ability to withstand shocks and build their own resilience is dependent on a range of factors. such as their health, their financial and other resources, and gender equality aspects. And access to emergency preparedness or recovery tools can influence the outcomes of a response. Participation in climate governance by all actors across all sectors at all levels is therefore important, as most mitigation of risk management occurs at household level. Finally, in governance, there is always a need for more transparency, more accountability, which I now hand over to Professor Jonas Ebbesson to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Professor Jonas, please take the floor.
Thank you, Ayman, and thank you everyone who has joined us for this seminar. So in my short talk, I want to highlight how the legal context for addressing climate change, information, governance, and justice have shifted in the last decade or so. Obviously, concerns for water are part of almost any dispute, negotiation, action plan, strategy, lawsuit, discourse, or news concerning climate change, whether at the global or local level, and whether in cases concerning mitigation or adaptation. The seriousness of climate change was recognized already in the early 1990s by the adoption of the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And by ratifying this treaty, about 200 states have confirmed that the risk for climate change is real and requires common efforts at the international level. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, this is, yes. Since the Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed almost 30 years ago, at the global level, access to information, governance, and justice have essentially remained interstate matters within the given legal frameworks. Access to information has focused on states gathering information and exchanging information on climate change research and measures taken to reduce climate change or adapt to climate change. As far as governance is concerned, it has also been kept mainly at the interstate level, not least with the regular conferences of the parties, where various measures have been agreed and decided on policy and technical matters. Finally, the concerns for justice have also referred mainly to interstate situations. The principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which has been a fundamental element in the climate change politics globally, is one such example. At the global level, in the climate change regime, however, domestic or local climate change injustices have not been much addressed. In fact, states could even benefit internationally by ignoring concerns for domestic climate change justice. Nor was public access to information or public participation in policy making and decision making related to climate change essential. For sure, states have taken their own initiatives by adopting climate change legislation. Nevertheless, to simplify, most of what has been done to combat climate change was done in response to this global treaties, and the move was top down. Now, this has changed significantly. Please, next slide. Now, in addition to the interstate activities and legal developments within the Framework Convention on Climate Change, we see much activity at the ground all over the world. Not only are the number of climate change manifestations on the streets increasing, we also see increasing activities through the number of lawsuits to highlight access to climate information, governance, and justice. According to some databases, more than 1,500 climate change lawsuits has been initiated around the world in the last decade or so. They are very diverse. They involve different kinds of issues, processes, remedies, and actors. Some lawsuits are big and strategic, others are minor and more regular in style. Some are brought against companies, industries, and others against states. And they challenge decisions and acts, but also push states and companies to do more. Just to give you a few examples. In Pakistan, a farmer sued the federal government successfully for being too passive in implementing the climate change policy. The court agreed and ordered the state to take a number of actions. In Colombia, a number of youth sued the presidents and other government bodies to protect constitutional rights and prevent deforestation of the Amazon. climate change was one of the adverse effects of deforestation, the Supreme Court agreed and ordered the state to take measures to protect forest and prevent climate change. In the Netherlands, the foundation Urgenda was successful in having the court ordering the state to take much more ambitious efforts to reduce its release of greenhouse gases than it had agreed previously. Recently in Ireland, the Supreme Court quashed the government's climate plan for not being in accordance with the Climate Act. There is a pending case where a Peruvian farm has sued a German electricity company in Germany for causing harm to his homeland and having sued for compensation because of the causes from this energy company. That case is not yet resolved. But what these lawsuits have in common, whether against companies or states, is first that they concretize the abstract and complex context by attributing liability to different actors. For instance, the fossil fuel industry and governments. Thus, they show the causality between the causes and adverse effects. This is fundamental. Second, in many lawsuits, the link between climate change and human rights is emphasized, and that is no less fundamental. In these situations, access to climate information refers to access for members of the public. Governance refers to public participation in policy making and decision making. And justice refers to justice for non-actors, whether individuals, organizations, or even for species or certain natural environments. Next slide, please. So this development, which moves bottom up, has not replaced the other legal setting and the global negotiations on climate change. Rather, it complements it. Obviously, climate change will not be resolved in the courtroom, yet the courtroom provides an important arena to highlight shortcomings in climate action and to address information, governance, and justice relating to global climate change processes in local contexts. Important for justice, it's important for the legitimacy of climate change measures, and it's also important for citizens' engagement and effective policies to combat climate change. I think this is a trend that we will see more of. Again, the courtroom will not resolve it by itself, but in combination with increasing manifestations on the street, with increasing engagement of citizens, this is a very important means to address climate change, not least in local context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonas, and to all the speakers for very interesting presentations. I think it brings beautifully the way that the three aspects are so intertwined. And looking at, you know, just from the last slide and going up, or starting from the top and going down, is how the justice, how the pressure can be built, this type of accountability, is it going upwards or downwards? And you find that people, once they are putting pressure further on climate actors, it complements what the trend that we're seeing mostly in the past was for governments to sit and talk and so on. But now you're having this coming. And this obviously is being supported by sharing of information. So to me, information knowledge is a burden. So once you have that burden, you have to act on it. And this is where we say, you know, okay, this information, how do we communicate it? And this is what I'm seeing in most of the Q&A. And maybe I'll just go there straight away, is how can complex climate information be shared with the public? I think there are a number of these questions that go into there, and I think Eric, this is something that you can pick on. And how can we impose or work with a sense of collaborative urgency to shift the current water governance to better address the cross-cutting nature of climate chaos? That's also from Tira Okamoto, a question. And the third question is a similar question to the first that we posed. 2 basic data information related issues faced by South Asia. The updating of the IPCC report, especially about Himalayan region, This is very specific to Asia, linking extreme weather events with climate change. For example, the monsoon pattern that we heard. A fourth question, which is looking at the policies. What policies are needed for developing not only robust climate information system, but more credible, that are trusted by non-state actors? So that's also around the information. If you can take them all together, it's important to engage climate change concept on education, schools, universities, and give youth more power to participate. I think I will just stop there for these, the first lot of questions, and I will deal with the other questions that we had posted before. Eric, you want to go first?
Yes, I can start, and I can start with a few of them. You have to remind me if I don't get them all.
Okay.
I can start with the one on Asia, which is specific there. There is a question about updating the IPCC reports, for instance, on the Himalayan region. And I think this is very important, since the IPCC reports, they are quite global in the nature. And even if they have some kind of regional context, there is a strong need also to get this information more specific to the different regions. And there are a number of these regional climate change assessments around the world. There is one for the Arctic region, for instance. There is one or a few here for parts of Northern Europe, and one for the Middle East and the North African region. And these assessments are growing with time. And I think it's important that regionally there is an effort to work with these assessments. So that's a thing that really is needed, since that information is important. So that was about the regionalization of the assessments, and I think that's a really urgent question. Then there were a lot different other questions about how to communicate this complex information, and I think there are different ways to do that. And I think, for instance, weather services or climate services institutions should really, as I said in my presentation, work very close with users. And this can be users of different kinds. It need not always be the general public directly, but it could be water managers in some context, etc., to really discuss their problems and discuss how to convey information which is then relevant for these specific users and in their context. That can often go back to looking into the climate in the region, looking at maybe some historical events that they have already seen, and trying to link those to the climate change signal to see, okay, this is something we saw last year, it can be much worse in the future, or it will change in this or that way. That can be a very nice way of communicating quite complex problems in a way that can be easily understandable. So these were at least some of them. I can stop there maybe.
There's one question just on the free access to climate data. Do you want to just say something? What are the resources out there people are asking?
Yeah, that's true. It's also a very good question. And this is very different in different places. I can start with saying what we are trying to do from the climate modeling, the climate model researchers in the world. We are working together in quite large international collaborations, and we have these experimental protocols for how we are running our models, what scenarios we are producing, but also protocols around which data to save and to publish and make openly accessible. So there are databases with climate model projections, both from global models, but also from regional models at higher resolution, getting more into details in all of the different continents actually. So that kind of information is getting there more and more. If we then start looking at the historical records and the observations, this is very different in different both regions and different countries and how that's handled. So it's more on a national level. I think there is a strive in many countries to go more for open access of data, but this is not the case everywhere. And I think that's something that can be, that should also be advocated. And it's a good way if we can go along that direction.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Eric. I think the questions are coming thick and fast. And just to go into the next one, there was a question around governance. How can we impose or work with a sense of collaborative urgency to shift current water governance to better address the cross-cutting nature of climate chaos? Would someone want to respond to that, or must I do?
That is a philosophical question. It's yeah, $100,000 billion question. Eamon, maybe you want to say something from your perspective there.
Yes, I think the urgency to shift the current water governance. I believe that the governance discourse hinges on the decentralization, which in many countries is maybe lagging behind. There is still a centralization which slows down the response and the engagement of participation. And I would say that this in let's say non-democratic setups where decentralization in general is not happening in a country, this is really where the focus should be. And I believe that it's the climate response falls short in those countries because of the lack of participation of people, because this is the level where the resilience needs to be built and the response needs to be built as well. We go further into another question which we received from Caroline Solik, Climate Resilient Infrastructure Development Facility. And I think also it talks about experience on engaging stakeholders, and especially when dealing with complex climate information. And if there are, in South Africa, they've used maps and diagrams to aid in sharing information visually, but they would like to see if there are other ways of sharing information so that you can engage people. And I think from my side, experience shows that there are a lot of tools that can help in engaging stakeholders. And one of them is taking transect walks, collective, using landmarks in the area for engagement with the Landsat image at the bottom, or a satellite image that would allow the stakeholders to geo-reference amongst themselves, with what is happening on the ground and where they, from their memory or from their knowledge, locations are. And in that way, the contact time is very useful for building trust, but at the same time for translating the information that the inhabitants or stakeholders living in an area know into to be factored into the kind of scientific knowledge that that is collected. I mean, this is some of the experience that I have. Anybody else would like to add to this before we go to the other questions?
I can come in here if I may.
Yeah.
I can say that we have mention a few things about the Swedish experience. We are at the Swedish Met Office. We are providing scenarios in Sweden, and we are having a very long-term collaboration with the county administrative boards in Sweden, and they are the ones responsible for climate change adaptation on a regional scale. We have been working with them for like 10 years or so, discussing the climate scenarios, the information that we can provide, and they have talked to us about their needs, and then we have had a communication about which maps and which indices to provide and how they can interpret that. So that's I think that kind of long-term commitment and is really important here to really get to the user needs. So that's one way of working with it, and it can be done in other ways in other countries as well, of course, but that's one idea.
Okay, thanks, Eric. There's another question to Jonas. What would be the challenge for countries with command control norms with respect to the trend of increasing judicial cases regarding environmental matters?
Well, that is a challenge to all countries that has developed some kind of an environmental or climate legislation, that it essentially includes various rules for command and control. It's a concept that I don't like very much. I think it's essentially, it's a way of defining liabilities and what is required from companies. But I would think that by being able to address this in court, by being able to participate in decision making, and by being able to request information, members of the public, non-state actors in different forms, have a greater opportunity to address exactly those points, because command and control usually means legal requirements for corporations on how to behave and then to control that. And citizens can act to enforce the law in addition to public authorities. And we see such changes, coming back to how law has developed. We have an interesting development in many countries, but also internationally. Globally, the United Nations Environment Programme, or what's called UN Environment, has developed principles for members of the public to have access to these pieces of information and to request and try to enforce them. In regions in Europe, with the Aarhus Convention that Jenny mentioned, and in the jurisprudence of the Human Rights Court, these issues have been addressed, but also in Latin America with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the recently adopted Escazú Agreement, and in Africa within the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. These issues have been addressed, and I think they could improve the possibility for members of the public to refer to and to engage these requirements and to force them on companies and others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think a group of other questions are talking about the potential for the opportunities for having access to open access information, and also the kind of opportunities that exist for using satellite records to enhance historic and observed data. Also, how could we use the climate change concept on education, schools, universities, and give youth more power to participate? I think how do we take that into that sector of society, from the schools to the universities, so that the youth are better exposed? Because I think now they're not in the mainstream, they're not mainly maybe participating, they're not farmers, they're not. So how does that get to them? I know from a research point of view, I mean, universities are involved in doing research, but not necessarily into policy making or decision making. So these are two questions. The one is that on the open source access, and the other is people are challenging how can stakeholders participate when information is expensive, the information is not available in many developing countries, and that's a hindrance. So it will be governments that talk to whether that represents the interests of the people on the ground or not is something else. So Eric, you want to have a stab at it? Two
yes,
questions.
I can start with my notion on the information side and on the satellite information, remote sensing data, and I would like to say that there is a lot of activities ongoing here to try to, first of all, make much of that information available. That's being done both within Europe and for instance in North America, but I don't really know exactly about all other places, but there are being built large databases which are really open for open access to anyone, so data can be downloaded and used from there. There's also a lot of research ongoing how to try to blend this information with in situ surface-based measurements, for instance. We have projects in Sweden with radar data and rain gauges, for instance, and there are similar projects in many other places. So that kind of data is becoming more and more available. And also much of this remote sensing data and observational data goes also through weather prediction models to produce something we call reanalysis data. And that's also data with global coverage, and these data are also available at some places. So there is a lot of activity here. But then, of course, I realized it's of course also a governance issue. All countries don't provide this information, but I'm saying here that some of this information can be maybe downloaded from other places as well.
Anybody else? Jonas? Yes?
I think maybe one can challenge that view that it is the youth which is prevented from having information. My impression in the last few years is that it's the youth that is actually driving very much from below the climate change initiatives and engagement. That's what we have seen in all these manifestations. And it seemed to be, well, at least as informed as many people who are not that young. So of course, it is an essential point, but I think that not least through social media and through sharing information, this seems to be no less enlightened than older generations. What I want to stress in terms of access to information, I think there are a couple of challenges and threats, and one was addressed by Eric and also by you yourself before, and that is when the costs related to access to information. Obviously, it is expensive to gather the information that Eric mentioned, satellite information and all that. But there is indeed obligations on a number of states, which has been confirmed again in Human Rights Council, that they have to provide such information free of cost or at very low costs for members of the public. So the cost issue is one important point, and in particular information gathered by public authorities. The second threat is when not least private companies, but also public authorities and meteorological and hydrological institutes, sometimes they refer to the ownership, the intellectual property rights for denying access to information. I think this is a challenge. It has been addressed within the Århus Convention, arguing that you cannot claim, well, you can claim intellectual property rights, but that doesn't mean that you can prevent the information from being released. Intellectual property right is a way of commercializing information, but a public authority cannot prevent access to members of the public for intellectual property reasons. And getting the access to use it is not the same as then using it for commercializing it, but to ensure your right as a citizen or to protect the environment in one way or the other. So I think these are challenges, and I think that is around the world. Of course, the situations look different in different regions, but costs and reference to intellectual property rights to prevent access are something that has to be fought against.
Thanks, thanks, Jonas. I think from my side, I would say that mainly in developing countries, I mean, information around climate change is really not easy to find. Even at state level, they probably don't have it, but there is a big opportunity in the regional assessments, in the global assessments that are made accessible. Then I think we start getting equity, if you like. But then comes the regional detail, the scale issue comes into being. But at least having a global picture is something that the more we get the open access, the more accessible that becomes. We have a last question, which I think we need to stop after that, which is speaking about the Jenny, what you showed in one of the slides is how water is so central to many other sectors and how it contributes to most of the SDGs as water. And the question is, how can SDG 6.5 achieve good governance and justice where we have not only climate change, but we have changes that are due to, say, the pandemic, the reason why we're having this webinar that is before us. And how could we build back better from the pandemic forwards? I mean, what would we do differently now that we're faced with this?
Thank you. We often talk about water as the blue thread that connects everything that we see in terms of climate change, climate crisis effects. Eamon, you mentioned initially that we see both floods and droughts at the same time. We have wildfires, which is also very much connected to droughts. So yes, water is the connector that makes it apt to sit in the middle when we look at different sectors. But of course, it depends on the perspective you take. For us who live in the water community, who live and breathe water, it's only natural that we see water at the very center. But this question also related to IWRM, Integrated Water Resources Management, which has become a type of an approach or a concept with its very own principles. And it relates or builds very much on looking at the river basin as the unit based on which you should do planning and decision making and so on. To me, this is a little bit restrictive because it is a geographical unit. The integration that is called for means that all other types of sectors that are relevant for the river basin planning, management, etc., should also be taken into account. All kinds of stakeholders, etc., etc. And that may sound as a very holistic view from which to start discussions and go towards decision making and implementation. But I actually think that we need to go beyond IWRM. And the SDGs, this is related to in one of the SDG targets. But the SDG, and especially SDG 6, actually talks about water from very many other perspectives as well. And I mentioned in my short presentation SDG 17 and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. And those partnerships that need to be built globally, regionally, locally, at all governance levels, they do include, they must address COVID-19, pandemics to come, very many other waterborne diseases, etc., etc., etc. As Emma will very soon tell us all, we have not addressed the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, directly in this webinar, but we will soon come to that. So over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Ginny, and thanks to all the speakers. I think this is all that we have time for. Someone was asking about the recording. All the session has been recorded and will be sent to all the registered participants. This webinar aims to start a conversation. So this is not the end of it. And the conversation will be on linking information, governance, and justice by a number of other opportunities. In October 2020, we have another webinar, which is building off this session and leading to the World Water Week for next year. And the webinar will be specifically for, with the title, Water Equity, Climate Resilience, and COVID-19, because I think there is a lot to discuss when it comes to the resilience built around the changes that we see now. And we believe that the world will be different in the future, how we do things. And one of the questions that this webinar will be answering will be, are there areas where mutual research in information, governance, and justice can come together, or is it needed to linking all these three together? And also take note that for August 2021, the World Water Week, we will also have a mock trial, which is looking at the equity issue and something that Jonas has mentioned about the lawsuits and the litigation when it comes to justice, access to information, and so on. Where is the recourse that stakeholders can adopt for addressing this? So at the end of the seminar, I would like to thank you for your participation, thank all the speakers, and most sincerely thank Ms. Katie Lackey, our young scientific program committee member, and the senior program manager at the US Water Alliance, who has been the maestro behind the scenes with all these fancy technologies. And as we said, recordings will be sent to all registered participants. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.